How did I get into film? Okay, I always wanted to be an actress. That's what I really, really wanted to do. But when I was in undergrad, I felt like I couldn't justify majoring in theater. It just felt, I'm not sure. I just felt like it felt like I needed to do something more academically rigorous or something. And I also had a lot of interest in psychology. And so I was studying psychology, and everyone was like getting summer internships and like doing research. And I was just like, I don't know, I was not doing any of those things. And I didn't do that my freshman year. And then it was approaching the summer after my sophomore year, and I still hadn't found anything. And I came across this opportunity to apply for a grant to film a documentary. And I thought, like, I mean, that's not related to psychology, but it was like, that seems like something cool I could do with my summer. Like, I don't know, that seems like a good thing. They were like taking applications for documentary concepts anywhere in the Pacific Rim. I had heard about this Pacific island country called Kiribati. It's like a very low-lying, like atoll nation. And this would have been like 2015. And at that time, scientists had begun predicting that it'd be the first country ever to be submerged underwater because of rising sea levels as a result of climate change. But there was very little information about it, like that was publicly available online. And I was like 19. I didn't really know what the heck I was doing, but I thought, let me like write this grant about like going to Kiribati, and like I'll talk to people and like see like what's a regular Kiribati people think about what's happening. And remarkably, I got it. I like had never even picked up a camera before, didn't know what I was doing. And I then went and spent like 2 months that summer living in Kiribati. When I returned, I like ended up like almost like dropping out of all my classes and just like editing this film for 6 months. And I mean, I taught myself how to use editing software and like how to shoot. And it wasn't
sometimes that's the best way to learn, just like diving in the deep end.
Totally. And it wasn't like a brilliant film, like as a piece of art by any means, not that. But it just sparked something in me where I thought, this is what I'm supposed to be doing with my life. And since then, I spent a lot of time trying to sort of like decolonize my approach to documentary filmmaking. What does it mean for me to be like working with like indigenous populations, with like, sort of the history of documentary as like this, you know, like colonial tool, and like there's all of these different. It's very layered and it's a lot to it. I feel like I realize like that my film does have power, and
I personally think that the impact that a film has is. And the reach is sometimes more valuable than what it looks like or how artsy it is. Or
yeah, I'm very curious to hear about you. Like, I know you've been making films since you were pretty young, way younger than me.
I guess I had a quite different experience than you going into filmmaking because I started very early, but I never thought I would become a filmmaker. It was just a class that I took in high school, and then I just like fell in love. But the classes were very different from what you would expect like a high school film class to be. And like I had gone into it thinking that like I'm gonna make some YouTube skits and like maybe I'll be a beauty guru or something. But our teacher was he provoked us to think deeper about filmmaking and our artistic reasons and the reason why we're making a film, and to put purpose in our work. And the teacher sat every one of us down and asked us like, okay, I want you to make this film about something that is important to you. So like do this list of values in your life that comprise you as a person today, as like a 15-year-old. I did that exercise and it was probably not a very interesting list, but on that list was one of my traumas that I wasn't able to articulate at that time. And so I made my film on that trauma, and just being able to let out this like eruption of years of emotions that I had without necessarily needing to say it through words. It was so therapeutic. And I felt like there was a power in this art form after that. And so I created personal films, and I was experimenting with like animation and live action and all this stuff. After high school, I learned that working in film as a one-man crew is totally not for me. I'm not the best at everything. And it was really nice to learn that if you're able to share your stories with your collaborators and allow their creativity to help you elevate what you want to say, is just so much more fulfilling than being able to try to control everything yourself.
Looking through your work, like you make a lot of personal work and your family is in most of it. And I see a lot of recurring themes.
And how do you come up with your concepts? Because I see that for me, I'm trying to branch out. I feel like I create my concepts like personally first, and then I try to make it universal, whether or not that involves my family. But it always starts with like an experience or a feeling that I have like in me. And from what I see with your work, you have this core of addressing social issues, but you always branch out to different subjects and different forms of filmmaking.
I think we're on opposite trajectories. I started outward and have been slowly making my way in. And I feel like you started making very personal work, and now like you express or trying to like expand. I think all of my films are very, very personal, but I'm sort of trying to find myself reflected in the world. And I think that is like a good safe space. It's a little distance, and it's not, not everyone needs to know exactly why it's being made, but for me, I always understand. Of course, for some reason, I find my own life just like, I think I'm so close to it, I can't find the beauty and the metaphor in my own life. And I'm really curious, like how, like in No Crying at the Dinner Table, like you came to some of your imagery.
Well, I am and was very interested in kind of another dimension that blending documentary and fiction creates. And in No Crying, I thought it served as a really good metaphor for kind of like the facade that a lot of families and my family have between what they express and what they keep to themselves, and how we connect with each other every day. I think that in a lot of Asian cultures, there's saving face, and then there's also saving face within the family, because certain emotions are not seen as strong. And so I thought that fiction added a really interesting layer to express that facade side, and to provoke that thought of like, oh, I wonder what they're doing when she's in the bathtub or when my dad is praying, and then contrast that with like what their actual stories are, and something very raw and vulnerable. And so I think a part of me right now also when I work with my personal stories is kind of making sense of my upbringing and my culture with more of a three-dimensional perspective.
This is leading me to another question. I was curious about No Crying at the Dinner Table. I'm curious, what was the film that you set out to make opposed to the film that you ended up making?
I am a very methodical documentary filmmaker. I feel like I approach things almost like fiction. Like I script it, I storyboard it, I make like art mood boards. Each shot when we came to set was already planned, and we had like our lighting plans and all this. It was very fiction-like. But the parts that I couldn't predict were the interviews and how they would react to hearing their interviews back to them. My mom, we had originally set out to talk about her postpartum depression. And I thought this film would be more about mental illness in the Asian community than intergenerational trauma, which was a word that I hadn't even heard before when I made this film. So I think that goes to show that when you follow a feeling very specifically, you will find that word, or you will find that thing you're trying to point to. She wasn't kind of reacting and giving the same care for that subject as she was in the pre-interviews. I was like, okay, I have to switch it up so that her interview is just as strong, and that it's just as much about feelings and grief and expressing yourself as my dad and my sister's interviews. And luckily we had talked about other subjects in her pre-interview, so we switched it to something that she was passionate about. And then for the reactions at the dinner table, I honestly thought that my family would just sit there still silently and like not do anything, because that's kind of how we would react normally. And I don't know what kind of film I would have been making, and like if that would have portrayed my family well, if that had ended up happening. I think in the beginning, I was just trying to make a commentary on this facade, but I had no idea that the whole room would be in tears, like even my cameraman who didn't understand Vietnamese. So it was really emotional. So when I had that footage, I was like, oh my God, like I have to reevaluate my whole film. Like, what exactly am I trying to say? And how do I want to edit this? So this leads me to a question that I wanted to ask you about gallery. I'm really in awe of the way that you are able to find intimacy and connect with your subjects in more of like a live, capturing the moment type of filmmaking, and being able to find the right frame and the right angles in the moment, which is something that I'm not used to. How do you make those decisions in the moment? And do you come to the set with any preparations?
I co-directed that film with a friend of mine who's also in my MFA program with me. I did shoot it, so I had to make all those choices on the fly, which was really difficult. It was very frightening because we basically, the class is like 3-4 hours long, and initially we had hoped we could maybe record like 2 different evenings of the class just so that we could have more material to work from. But the woman who runs the class was like, no, you just get this one. And we had never attended the class before, so we didn't even know what it looked like. We did do a lot of pre-planning. The place where the class took place was my friend's house. So I asked her if we could host it at her house. So at least I knew what space it would be in. And we did like a little set designing, not extensively. Like a lot of the pillows were actually like couch cushions from my sister's couch. And we had sort of like already discussed like where I would go to shoot. Like we had a few stations, sort of like, okay, you know, like you could, like I can be at this, like this specific spot, like in the dining room, and like this spot on the couch, and we would leave them open. We wanted to be as least disruptive as possible. The woman running the class had made it very clear that we couldn't interrupt in any way. There could be no directing of any kind, and we really needed to be as invisible as possible. And we discussed, we sort of knew what was going to happen, right? Like we know that there's going to be a point where everyone's going to be peering into legs. Like we know that this happens in the class, so it's going to happen. So we discussed like what kind of angle would we want to shoot that at. But the evening itself, was all spontaneous. We had never met any of the people who were going to attend the class. Part of it was also like needing to gain the trust of people very, very quickly. I think, in terms of sort of like relationship building, it's just about being a person and coming in with humility. And yeah, it was difficult. Like the film I had made before that was Joy Child, and Joy Child was shot on a Bolex. So nothing on a Bolex is spontaneous because I had to like crank it up. And
when you go to film school and just like traditionally how filmmaking is taught and how filmmaking was made, like what is good cinema, we often think about, the technique, and we think about the things that we can control and the things that we can make beautiful. But we often neglect like the aspects that documentary brings, which is community building, which is relationships, which is where am I going to be in the room, or like how am I going to point this camera in this very spontaneous moment. So Aurora, how do you build trust with your interview subjects on set?
I received that question a lot, especially about Joy Child.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's actually an exchange of vulnerability is typically how I've been able to make people feel most comfortable. Like when I was making Joy Child, although I wasn't open about this with the people in my cohort, I was very open about it with the families and the children, that my partner was trans, and I was really working through my feelings, and that's where my interest in this film came from.
Mm-hmm.
And I was asking these families and these kids to do something that was brave, I guess, because a lot of people have strong feelings about gender expansive people, and especially by gender expensive kids. And by being in the project, that was really opening them up to a lot of potential harassment. And I think it's about me being a vulnerable person and being a real person and not seeing the people I'm filming as just the object of my film, but as full people, and acknowledging what a privilege it is to be given the immense honor and weight of representing another person's life, another person's story, and for me to also be giving something in return. Yeah, I'm curious for yourself. I mean, I know that a lot of your films are personal films. So I'm curious, how have you made your family feel comfortable?
Well, I think I approach my subjects and my relationships in documentaries very similar to you. I think we make films and about subjects which we want to have a relationship with, we want to understand, grow, or feel empowered by. So with my family, of course, they fit into all those boxes. And I think it's so important before you turn a camera on, like you said, to be able to have these conversations and create these safe spaces where you can express and feel vulnerable and exchange, even with me as a director. So you don't hear my story behind the camera in No Crying, but it was exchanged. It was something that I had to take part of the process as well. Also, when you make personal films, it's also building that relationship with yourself and kind of understanding these traumas or these feelings that you once weren't able to put a finger on. And I was very lucky that I had help from friends who were very actively listening to me, and also a therapist. I think at one point I questioned whether it was worth it for No Crying, if it had backfired, if I would have regretted it. For my family, that goes to show how much preparation it takes to create a safe space and a moment, because I had been making films so long with my family that they had grown that relationship with me as a director, with the camera, with the lights. It doesn't take days or months. Sometimes that takes years. And sometimes that takes self-work as well. It takes a lot of digging. And
I'm just really curious, like you were saying that you felt like a lot of the people who were giving you that advice they didn't really understand because they weren't coming from the perspective of what it means to be like an immigrant Asian family. And is that something that you feel like you struggled with as you've gone through film school or making films, like not having other, like having mentors or professors who can understand your cultural context and feeling like they can mentor you in a way that's sort of like culturally competent and informed?
Of course. And I feel like you probably can relate to this too as a person of color, but you're constantly having to explain yourself, explain your intentions and your story. And that can get really frustrating to a certain extent, because the people at the other end of the table who have the power might not see the value of what you're trying to say, or this blatantly simple thing about my family can't express their feelings is just like, okay, what's so important to that? So I feel like I have to do twice the work to be able to make sure that my story and the way I pitch it is understood by someone that's coming from a Western perspective or might not have the same background. But I think we also, forget that there are people around us that have different perspectives that help enrich our story to make it universal. And in a world where we want our art to touch everyone, I think that's so important, to take a specific story and be able to touch hearts from all different backgrounds. What's the best piece of advice that you've received for filmmaking, and maybe in life? Maybe it relates to filmmaking.
I think the best piece of advice I've received is actually from my mother. I've spent the last year making my thesis film, and it's about my mother and I, and trauma in her childhood that's gone to affect me. And it was such an excruciating process. I think because it was a pandemic, because I had like made a couple other films in grad school that people thought were good, and it felt like, oh no, like now there's all this pressure, like I need to make something great, and I was feeling like a fraud, like. And it was also that I was like unpacking these traumas in my life and in my mother's life, and I was doing really poorly emotionally, and I was crying, and my mom was like, like, it's an amazing thing that you have the privilege to be able to be an artist and make films and choose this path in life. She did not have the same opportunities to pursue her own individual goals. And she was expressing to me, like, don't let that crush you, because like this is an amazing thing, and it's not worth making yourself miserable over the privilege of making art. Let this be your joy and not like your grief. It really sort of like returned me to reality, and sometimes I say this all the time. I'll be like, why is this? It's not brain surgery. Like, no one's gonna die. Like, I should be able to like let go and relax. But I just put so much of my value into my filmmaking and my worth, and it just feels so important. And she was just sort of reminding me, like, with this privilege, like, enjoy your life, enjoy this process, and don't let it become something that crushes you. And I think that that's been like really, really helpful. Honestly, I think it's been so helpful. What is the best piece of advice that you've received?
The one that comes to mind right now is from a past mentor who told me, don't forget to live. And I think in this capitalistic world where like productivity is so valued, you're kind of always in this machine of thinking, what can I do to progress? How can I think about my future to advance? And you're always planning and to-do lists and all these things. But, as an artist, he said, you need to continuously grow and enrich your storytelling through experiences. So you need that space to like see the sunset, to experience heartbreak and love, and to find the little joys in life. Of course, for self-love and for your mental health, but also to enrich your stories. And I think that's why we see a lot of people in Hollywood like making the same film every time, because they don't have that nuance to their everyday, to the mundane. I take those experiences very, very seriously, and I try to carve out always like time for myself.